In modern neurobiology, consciousness is understood as an epiphenomenon. It is treated as a secondary byproduct generated strictly by the synaptic interactions and neurochemical processes of the physical brain. The governing axiom of this model is simple: your mind is what your brain does. When physical structures generating those electrical signals shut down, conscious experience must mathematically cease to exist. But in 1986, working in the intensive care unit of a Dutch hospital, cardiologist Dr. Pin van Lommel began documenting cases that violated this axiom. Patients successfully resuscitated from clinical death were reporting highly structured, vivid conscious experiences, memories that were formed precisely when their brains were physically offline. Complex memory formation without localized brain function is a biological impossibility under current materialist physics. It presents a paradox that forces us to either ignore the clinical data or rethink the physical origin of the mind. To fully understand the profound weight of these reports, we have to look at the exact physiology of cardiac arrest. It begins with the cessation of circulation and an immediate, catastrophic drop in blood pressure. Without fresh oxygenated blood, the brain undergoes a rapid, systematic failure. This animated chart illustrates the electrical activity of the cerebral cortex. Within 10 to 20 seconds of the heart stopping, the electroencephalogram, the EEG, plummets to a complete flatline. An EEG flatline means the cerebral cortex, the area responsible for sensory perception and cognition, is entirely inactive. Immediately following this, the brainstem ceases to function, disabling the hardware required for even basic involuntary reflexes. In this state, there is absolutely zero neural activity capable of producing a hallucination, let alone a hyperlucid memory. Yet, this is exactly the window in which these patients report their experiences. For decades, accounts of near-death experiences were dismissed as anecdotal. To eliminate the bias of retrospective reporting, van Lommel designed a prospective study. Conducted between 1988 and 2001 across 10 different Dutch hospitals, the findings were ultimately published in the peer-reviewed medical journal, The Lancet. This diagram represents the study's cohort, 344 consecutive patients who were successfully resuscitated from cardiac arrest. All shared the exact same clinical criteria for death. When interviewed shortly after resuscitation, exactly 18% of this cohort reported profound, highly structured near-death experiences. Because 82% of the patients had no memory of the event, van Lommel had a perfect control group. This provided a scientifically rigorous framework to test, and potentially eliminate, the standard physiological explanations for these experiences. The critical question was whether the 18% anomaly could be explained by differences in the patient's physical or chemical states during resuscitation. This chart compares the duration of oxygen deprivation between the two groups. The data shows the lengths of clinical death are statistically identical. There was no correlation between the severity of oxygen loss and the occurrence of an experience. Anoxia does not explain the phenomenon. The researchers then isolated pharmacological interventions. The type and amount of medication administered during resuscitation also had no impact. They analyzed psychological preconditioning. Prior fear of death or specific religious education had zero statistical effect on whether a patient reported an experience. This leaves the final conventional counterargument that these events are simply endorphin-induced hallucinations. But a hallucination is a complex neural process. It demands a functioning cerebral cortex to be generated and to be stored as a retrievable memory. The Lancet study demonstrates that when these primary physical and psychological factors are neutralized, the anomaly remains. The evidence points to an origin outside the physical states of the dying brain. To account for this clinical data, van Lommel proposed a theoretical framework, the receiver hypothesis. Under this model, the brain does not produce consciousness. Instead, it acts as a transceiver, a sophisticated filter that facilitates awareness. Think of the biological brain as a television set. The television does not create the broadcast. It tunes into a specific frequency of an invisible electromagnetic field and translates it into a localized picture. This directly challenges the classical analogy that treats the brain as a computer hard drive, where smashing the physical drive destroys the data. When the television is unplugged during cardiac arrest, the broadcast doesn't stop existing. The receiver hypothesis provides a logical mechanism for the continuity of consciousness when the biological hardware shuts down. To provide a vocabulary for this non-local consciousness, van Lommel looks to the physics of wave-particle duality. In this analogy, our normal waking consciousness is the localized particle aspect of the mind. It is strictly anchored to the physical-body interface, operating within a three-dimensional grid. But its fundamental state is what van Lommel terms endless consciousness. This is the non-local wave aspect, existing as a ubiquitous property of the universe. This wave state operates in a phase space, a dimension free from the physical constraints of linear time and distance. A near-death experience, therefore, is a brief transitional window. As the biological interface shuts down, consciousness sheds its localized particle state and expands back into its fundamental, non-local wave state. Taking these physics out of the theoretical realm and back into the intensive care unit reveals immediate practical consequences. If consciousness operates independently of measurable brain function, the clinical definition of an unconscious or comatose patient requires intense scrutiny. This introduces severe ethical complexities to modern hospital protocols, particularly regarding organ donation. Harvesting organs from a clinically dead patient is built on the assumption that an inactive cortex means total annihilation of awareness. The data from the Lancet study directly challenges that assumption. These findings also carry implications for palliative care, radically altering how medical professionals approach end-of-life support. Accepting the continuity hypothesis demands an evolution in medical empathy. It forces the clinical establishment to treat death not as an absolute end to the self, but as a transitional state of awareness. This shift in perspective has coalesced into the Manifesto for a Post-Materialist Science, a movement championed by van Lommel and a growing body of international scientists. Their central argument is that the ideology of scientific materialism has artificially constricted the study of the mind for over a century. By providing peer-reviewed evidence of memory formation during clinical death, the 2001 Lancet study serves as the clinical cornerstone required to challenge strict reductionism. The objective is to integrate these anomalous reports into a model of non-local consciousness, where individual awareness connects to a persistent, fundamental field. Ultimately, incorporating these observations into a wider scientific model represents a direct response to the clinical evidence.